All right. Chapter 39, the scriptural view of Christ's divinity. Monstrous scientific paradox as coming ages will regard it, comprehended in the conception of an almighty, omnipresent, and infinite being, the creator of innumerable worlds. By him, Christ, were all things made that were made, John 1, 3 through 10, being born of a frail and finite woman, as taught by both the Oriental and Christian religion, is so exceedingly shocking to every rational mind, which has not been sadly warped, perverted, and coerced into the belief by early psychological influence that we would naturally presume that those who, on the assumption of the remote possibility of its truth, should venture to put forth a doctrine so glaringly unreasonable and so obviously untenable, would of course vindicate it and establish it by the strongest arguments and by the most unassailable and most irrefragable proofs, and that in setting forth a doctrine so manifestly at war with every law and analogy of nature and every principle of science, no language should have been used, nor the slightest admission made that could possibly lead to the slightest degree of suspicion that the original authors and propagators of this doctrine had either any doubt of the truth of the doctrines themselves or were wanting in the most ample, the most abundant proof to sustain it. Is one long sentence. No language, no text, not a word, not a syllable should have been used, making the most remote concession damaging to the validity of the doctrine, so that not the shadow of a shade of doubt could be left on any mind of its truth. Omnipotent indeed should be the logic, and irresistible the proof in support of a thesis or a doctrine which so squarely confronts and contradicts all the observation, all the experience, the whole range of scientific knowledge, and the common sense of mankind. How startling, then, to every devout and honest professor of the Christian faith ought to be the recent discovery of the fact that the great majority of the text having any bearing upon the doctrine of the divinity of Jesus Christ, a large majority of the passages in the very book on which the doctrine is predicated, and which is acknowledged as the sole warranty of such belief, are actually at variance with the doctrine and actually amount to its virtual denial and overthrow. For we find upon a critical examination of the matter that at least 3/4 of the text, both in the Gospels and epistles, which relate to the divinity of Christ, specifically or by implication, either teach a different and contrary doctrine or make concessions entirely fatal to it, by investing him with finite human qualities utterly incomparable with the character and attributes of a divine and infinite being. How strange, then, how superlatively strange that millions should yet hold to such a strange freak of nature, such a dark relic of Oriental heathenism, such a monstrously foolish and childish superstition as that which teaches the infinite creator and upholder of the universe could be reduced so near to nonentity, and was required to pass through the ordinary stages of human generation, human birth, and human patrition, a puerile notion with which reason, science, nature, philosophy, and common sense proclaim to be supremely absurd and self-evidently impossible, and which even the scriptures fail to sustain, a logical scriptural exposition of which we will here present a brief summary. 1. The essential attributes of a self-existing God and creator and upholder of all things are infinitude, omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence, and any being not possessing all these attributes to repletion or possessing any quality or characteristics in the slightest degree incompatible with any one of these attributes cannot be a God in a divine sense, but must of necessity be a frail, fallible, finite being. 2. There's a lot of these. Jesus Christ disclaims hundreds of times over, directly or impedingly, the inherent possession of any one of these divine attributes. 3. His evangelical biographies have invested him with the entire category of human qualities and characteristics, each one of which is entirely unbefitting a god, and taken together are the only distinguishing characteristics by which we can know a man from God. 4. Furthermore, there issued from his own mouth various sayings and concessions most fatal to his conception of his being a god. 5. His devout biographers have reported various actions and movements in his practical life, which we are compelled to regard as absolutely irreconcilable with the infinite majesty, lofty character, and supreme attributes of an almighty being. 6. The human qualities were so obvious to all who saw him and all who became acquainted with him that doubts sprang up among his own immediate followers, which ultimately matured into an open avowal of disbelief in his divinity in that early age. 7. Upon the axiomatical principles of philosophy, it is an utter and absolute impossibility to unite in repletion the divine and the human in the same being. 8. And then Christ had a human birth. 9. He was constituted in part like human beings of flesh and blood. 10. He became on certain occasions a hungered like finite beings. He also became thirsty, John 19:28, like perishable mortals. 12. He often slept like mortals and thus became to dumb forgetfulness a prey. And thus became to dumb forgetfulness a prey. 13. He sometimes became weary like human beings. See John, 4, 6? 14. He was occasionally tempted like fallible mortals. Matthew 4:1. 15. His soul became exceedingly sorrowful as a frail, finite being. Matthew 26:38. 16. He disclosed the weakness of human passion by weeping. John 11:35. 17. He was originally an imperfect being, made perfect through suffering. Hebrews 2:10. 18. He increased in wisdom and stature. Luke 2:52. Therefore, he must have possessed finite, changeable, mortal attributes. 19. And he finally died and was buried like all perishable mortals. He could not possibly, from these considerations, have been a god. It is utterly impractical to associate with or comprehend in a god of infinite powers and infinite attributes all or any of these finite human qualities. 20. Dark, intellectually dark, indeed, must be that mind and sorrowfully sunk in superstition that can worship a being as the great omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent I am, who possessed all these qualities which were constitutionally characteristic of a pious, the noble, the devout, the godlike, yet finite and fallible Jesus, according to his own admissions and his representations of his own interest biographers. 21. The only step which the disciples of the Christian faith have made towards disproving or setting aside these arguments, objections, and difficulties is that assigning the incarnate Jesus a double or twofold nature, the amalgamation of the human and divine, a postulate and a groundless assumption, which we have proved and demonstrated by 13 arguments, which we believe to be unanswerable, is not only absurd, illogical, and impossible, but foolish and ludicrous in the highest degree. See Volume 2. 22. The senseless hypothesis and every other assumption and argument made use of by the professors of the Christian faith to vindicate their favorite dogma of the divinity of Jesus, we have shown to be equally applicable to the demigods of the ancient heathen, more than 20 of whom were invested with the same combination of human and divine qualities with the followers and worshippers of Jesus claim to be. 23. Testimony of the Father against the divinity of the Son. The Father utterly precludes the Son from any participation in the divine essence or any claim in the Godhead by such declaration as the following: I am Jehovah, and besides me there is no Savior. Isaiah, wow, that's a big Roman numeral, XLIII. 11. How then, we would ask, can Jesus Christ be the Savior? I, Jehovah, am the Savior and the Redeemer. Then Christ can be neither the Savior nor Redeemer. There is no God else beside me, just God and a Savior. There is none beside me. Isaiah 14:21. So the Father virtually declares, according to the inspired prophet Isaiah, that the Son, in a divine sense, cannot be either God, Savior, or Redeemer. Again, I am Jehovah thy God, and thou shalt not acknowledge a God beside me. Hosea 13:4. Here Christ is not only by implication cut off from the Godhead, but positively prohibited from being worshipped as a god, and thus the testimony of the Father disproves and sets aside the divinity of the Son. 24. Testimony of the mother. When Mary found, after a long search, her son Jesus in the temple disputing with the doctors, and chided or reproved him for staying from the house without the consent of his parents, and declared, Thy father and I sought thee, sorrowing, Luke 2:48, she proclaimed a twofold denial of his divinity. In the first place, it cannot be possible that she regarded her son Jesus as that awful being, therefore whom the devout saints bow and trembling fear, when she used such language and evinced such a spirit as she did. Why hast thou thus dealt with us? Luke 2:48 is her chiding language. And then when she speaks of Joseph as his father, thy father and I, she issues a declaration against his divinity, which ought to be regarded as settling the question forever. For who could know better than the mother, or rather, who could know but the mother, who the father of the child Jesus was? And as she acknowledges it to Joseph, she thus repudiates the story of the Immaculate Conception, which constitutes the whole basis for the claim of his divinity. Hence, the testimony of the mother also disproves his title as the Godhead. Let's make a great episode of Maury Povich. 25. Testimony or disclaimer of the Son. We will show by a specific citation of 25 texts that there is not one attributed, comprehended in or particular to a divine and infinite being, but that Christ rejects as applicable to himself, that he most conclusively disclaims every attribute of a divine being, both by precept and practice, and often in the most explicit language. 26, by declaring the Son can do nothing of himself. John 5:19. He most emphatically disclaims the attribute of omnipotence. For an omnipotent being can need no aid and can accept of none. When they acknowledged and avowed his ignorance of the day of judgment, which must be presumed to be the most important event in the world's history, he disclaimed the attribute of omniscience. Of that day and hour knoweth no man, neither the Son, but the Father only. Matthew 24:36. Now, as an omniscient being must possess all knowledge, his avowed ignorance in this case is a confession he was not omniscient and hence not God. 8. And when he declares, I am glad for your sakes I was not there at the grave of Lazarus, he most distinctly disavows being omnipresent and thus denies to himself another essential attribute of an infinite God. 29. And the emphatic declaration, I live by the Father, John 6:57, is a direct disclaimer of the attributes of self-existence as a being who lives by another cannot be self-existent and per consequence not the infinite God. 30. He disclaims possessing infinite goodness, another essential attribute of the supreme divine being. Why callest thou me good? There is none good but one, that is God. Mark 10:18. 31. He disclaimed divine honors and directed them to the Father. I honor my Father. John 8:49. I receive not honor from men. John 5:41. 32. He recommended supreme worship to the Father and not to himself. The true worshiper shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. John 4:21. 33. He ascribes supreme dominion to the Father. Thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Matt 6:13. 34. It will be seen from the foregoing text that Christ also acknowledges that the kingdom is the Father's. A God without a kingdom would be a ludicrous state of things. 35. He conceded supreme authority to the Father. My doctrine is not mine, but his that sent me. John 7:16. 36. He considered the Father as the supreme protector and preserver of even his own disciples. I pray that thou shouldest keep them from the evil. John 27:15. What omnipotence not able to protect his own disciples? 37. In fine, he humbly acknowledged that his power, his will, his ministry, his mission, his authority, his works, his knowledge, and his very life were all from and belonged to and were under the control of the Father. I can do nothing of myself. I came to do the will of him that sent me. The Father that dwelleth within me, he doth the work, etc. A God within a God is an old pagan Otahitian doctrine. 38. He declared that even spiritual communion was the work of the Father. See John 6:45. 39. He acknowledged himself controlled by the Father. See John 5:30. 40. He acknowledged his entire helplessness and dependence on the Father. The Son can do nothing of himself, but what he seeth the Father do. John 5:19. 41. He acknowledged that even his body was the work of his Father. In other words, that he was dependent on his Father for his for his physical life. See Hebrews 16:5. 42. And more than all, he not only called the Father the only true God, John 27:3, but calls him my Father and my God, John 20:17. Now, it would be superlative nonsense to consider a being himself a God, or the God, who could use such language as is here to ascribe to the humble Jesus. This language is sufficient of itself to show that Christ could not have laid any claim to the Godhead on any occasion unless we degrade him to the charge of the most palpable and shameful contradiction. 43. He uniformly directed his disciples to pray, not to him, but to the Father. See Matt 6:6. 44. On occasion, as we have cited the proof in Matt 11:11, he even acknowledged John the Baptist to be a greater than he, while it must be patent to every reader that no man could be greater than the Almighty, supreme potentate of heaven and earth in any sense whatever. 45. Testimony of the disciples. Another remarkable proof of the human sireship of Jesus is that one of his own disciples, one of the chosen 12, selected by him as being endowed with a perfect knowledge of his character, mission, and origin, this witness thus posted and thus authorized proclaims in unequivocal language that Jesus was the son of Joseph. Here the language of Philip addressed to Nathanael. We have found him of whom Moses and the law and the prophets did write, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. John 1:45. No language could be more explicit, no declaration more positive that Jesus was the son of Joseph, and no higher authority could be adduced to settle the question, coming as it does from the headquarters what can the devout stickler for the divinely paternal origin of Jesus Christ do with such a testimony? Is a clincher which no sophistry can set aside, no reasoning can grapple with, and no logic overthrow. 6. His disciples, instead of representing him as being the only true God, often speak of him in distinction to God.